Hello, y'all, and welcome back. In this module, we will be exploring part of the thought of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, a controversial and polarizing thinker who is not an ethicist in anything like the traditional sense of that word, but with whom we must come to terms if we're going to be studying ethics in any capacity as we are in this course. So, a number of things that are important historical background for Nietzsche. First, his dates are 1844 to 1900. He is born and raised in Prussia, a country that doesn't exist anymore, but in which I spend quite a bit of time. Latvia and Lithuania are former Prussian territories. I mean, not as the countries, but they used to be Prussia, that part of the world. And he is trained as and studies as or works as rather a philologist. Philology is an extinct discipline, which is very, very roughly synonymous with classics, and even in the 19th and early 20th centuries is sometimes used synonymously with classics, but strictly speaking, these are different disciplines. A classicist, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but today as well, focuses predominantly, if not exclusively, on ancient Greece and Rome, and drills down very heavily into the language, thought, and culture, as well as the history of those two civilizations. Whereas a philologist, while they do know Greek and Latin and have a lot of familiarity with those cultures, is free to kind of roam beyond the bounds of those cultures into areas that we would now know as linguistics, just a study of language more generally. So the most famous philologist, I should think pretty obviously, is J.R.R. Tolkien, author of the Lord of the Rings books, who developed Elvish as a language, and then on the basis of that developed the Lord of the Rings and wrote these books, right? So this is kind of what a philologist, the type of thing a philologist would do, and this is Nietzsche's field. And he is very roughly a child prodigy philologist, not actually a child prodigy, but he is awarded right out of his undergrad education. He is awarded a tenured professorship at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He doesn't even have a doctorate at this point. He's awarded a doctorate a couple years later. On the recommendation, the legend goes, of his Professor Friedrich Nietzsche, who writes a letter to another member of the faculty at Basel saying he can do whatever he wants. Again, this might be apocryphal, but it is factual that Nietzsche is one of the youngest tenured classics faculty or philology faculty in the history of higher education. So Nietzsche, again, is a late 19th century thinker. Now, generally speaking, I'm very reluctant to do anything that looks like ascribing someone's views to the time period in which they lived. I think that's a mistake that moderns make a lot. We say, well, this person thinks that because of when they lived. And so I'm not going to do that with Nietzsche. However, it is impossible to understand the impetus, the origin of Nietzsche's project that we're looking at here today without understanding a certain amount about the intellectual culture of Western Europe in the latter half of the 19th century. So Nietzsche, as I say, is a philologist. He reads and takes seriously the ideas of a number of thinkers who are active in the early and mid, 19th century. So thinkers like David Strauss, who writes The Life of Jesus, Ludwig Feuerbach, who writes The Essence of Christianity, highly, highly critical of any supernatural elements found in the New Testament or in Scripture more generally. Ernst Renan, who writes more popular biographies of Jesus and Paul, again stripping these figures of their supernatural elements. But by far, the biggest work in terms of just impact across Western Europe, into the UK, Eastern Europe, America, and beyond, is Charles Darwin's 1859 book on the origin of species, introducing to the world not the theory of evolution. You find a very sophisticated theory of evolution in Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, for instance, which is expounding Epicurean philosophy. But the theory of natural selection, working on random genetic mutation to change and even to originate new species. And this was received in Western Europe very largely as the final nail in the coffin of theism. In kind of very rough outline, the debate, such as it was between believers in God, theists and atheists, up to that point had been limited by a general sense that the one thing atheists could not explain in a purely naturalistic way, that's to say, purely with recourse to the physical sciences and not with recourse to anything supernatural, was life. Biological life in all its forms seemed to have some element of magic or some element of the supernatural, which simply required the divine. And again, on the origin of species, and then Darwin's subsequent work and the work of other related thinkers, seem to kind of seal the deal, seem to say this is the explanation, the proper and truest sense of explanation of life, and it doesn't involve God. Along with the aforementioned historical critical approaches to Scripture and the influence of other thinkers, the late 19th century then saw Western Europe go from being a very largely and substantially Christian place to the largely secular place that we know it as today. And indeed, I think pretty obviously the most secular place on earth, or at least one of them, very generally speaking. And Nietzsche, who reads all of these thinkers, observes this change taking place. He has this kind of historical position to observe it taking place. And he diagnoses what's going on in one very famous statement, his most famous statement, and one of the most famous single quotes in the history of philosophy. Nietzsche looks and he says, God is dead. God is dead. Now, Nietzsche is not necessarily gloating over the death of God here. He's not saying he killed him. He's not saying it's a good thing that God is dead. He's saying God is dead. But what seems to concern Nietzsche is not the death of God, but the response that people in Western Europe, especially Western European self-styled intellectuals, have to the death of God. You see, very substantially, people are saying in Western Europe what you have heard people say, and what you may very well have said yourself. They say something like this. They say, I'm not religious. I don't believe in God. I don't subscribe to any religion. But I'm still a good person. I can still be, despite the fact that I don't believe in God, I'm not religious, I can still be a good person. And Nietzsche's response to this seems to be that that is just about the stupidest thing you could say. Given the death of God, that's about the stupidest and worst response that you could possibly have. Nietzsche seems to say, indeed, that if you had to choose between belief in and worship of God or gods, or just morality as it's traditionally understood, the former, some form of religion, would actually be preferable. Still not good, but preferable. Nietzsche says, morality is a fundamentally pernicious psychological force in human life and history. And to explain why this is, why it's such a bad thing, he says, I'm going to explain its origins. So he writes a work called The Genealogy of Morality, sometimes translated Genealogy of Morals, explaining via its genealogy, via its origin, why exactly morality is so bad, why it's so dangerous. And we're going to get into the details of that genealogy in the next video. Thanks.